Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Stories That Inspire Us, the author series. My name is Janice Malillo, your host. Today, I have an amazing guest. And before I do her introduction, I met Terri a few years ago, and I believe it was through a group coaching program. And we've always kept in contact. And Terri is a successful soul life coach, blogger, and author of the amazing book, Raven, Transcending Fear. I want to welcome to today's podcast my friend, Terri Kozlowski. Welcome, Terri.
Thank you, Janice. I'm very happy to be here with you and your audience to discuss the book, Raven, Transcending Fear.
And by the way, this book, I'm going to hold it up again. Amazing in so many different ways. And of course, as everyone can probably see, and unfortunately those who are on the audio right now cannot, but I have stickies all over the place. I want to start out by saying the name of this book, and as I read it, it made so much sense to me why this was called Raven, Transcending Fear. Can you just give us a little background on how you came up with that name? Because I think it is really important to your book.
So I am Native American, and I'm Athabascan Tlingit tribe, Raven clan. So Raven is my family totem on my mother's side. And the story that is told in this is about the relationship that I have with my mother, or lack thereof, and why there is a lack of relationship with my mother. But at the same time, the heritage that is really part of my identity is wrapped up in that mother line, especially for Native Americans. Native Americans go through maternal lines versus paternal lines, and therefore that mother line is very, very vital to all those ancient things that rise up within us that we know who we authentically are. And if we don't tap to that maternal side as a Native American, we never quite realize what our true essence is, because there's a long line of ancient warriors that are fighting alongside me as I make it through each and every day. So the Raven, when I started researching it in high school, I realized was not just a Native American symbol, but a symbol throughout history. And, for a lot of people who have been, who watch the Viking story, Raven is part of the Viking heritage. Raven is also the first bird that is released during the Noah's Ark story in the Bible. And the raven actually doesn't come back. And the reason the raven doesn't come back is because the raven is very, very thrifty, very able to things, and didn't have to come back because it found a way to survive. Whereas the dove came back bringing the olive branch, showing that the earth had been renewed. Also, part of the transcending portion of Raven is that there's a lot of history negatively towards the raven because of a famous poet. Some of you may know him as Edgar Allan Poe. He wrote a famous poem about ravens, and it was very dark. And what people don't realize is that a raven actually does show up a lot at death, but there's a reason for it. And in the Native American tradition, the reason is that raven is helping that spirit transcend to a higher plane. And when we look at fear is a very egoic-based drive. It is part of the basal portion of the brain and that fear response. And therefore, for us to transcend that fear and move to a higher plane, move to a higher vibrational frequency, move into our authentic being, we have to transcend that fear.
Thank you so much. I love how you explain that, but it also coincides obviously with your book, because each chapter that you wrote, you explain, for instance, a little bit how Raven is associated, I want to say, in that chapter. For instance, chapter 1, and I gotta click through my all my things here. Um, you really start at the beginning, which I thought was so important to the overall your overall story and how that correlates with things that have happened in your life. And the first thing I knew it was going to be somewhat of a tearjerker, but as you wrote in your note, it does have a happy ending. So I want to
It
make that
does.
it does. I want to make that perfectly clear to everyone. But the first thing, a lot of things that stood out to me. The very first thing that stood out to me was you're talking about codependency. And I thought, my gosh, she's about 4 or 5 years old, 5 years old, I believe it was. And you're going back to your story, that beginning for you. And talking about codependency, I felt so many emotions from you that at such a young age, you put yourself into the position of the caregiver, basically.
And a lot of children do that without ever realizing that that's something that they're doing. And that's what it is. And for me, being a child of an alcoholic, a lot of alcoholics end up having relationships with their children that are very codependent. And the reason I started way back when was because I was who I authentically was meant to be when I came into the world, just as we all are. And those things that happen to us in our childhood that are very formative change who we think we authentically are, because we conform, we blend in, we try to live up to expectations of the parental figures and the adults in our lives, instead of pushing back and saying, no, that's not who I am. That's who you want me to be, but that's not who I am. And it's not until we end up in our 20s and 30s that we start figuring out who we really are.
And thank you so much for that, because I was like, oh my God. And in fact, you, on the cover of your book, this is somewhat of a memoir. And you say it's a memoir about overcoming sexual abuse, abandonment, and discovering your true authentic self. And as you described, in so going back, you have ultimately discovered your true authentic self, which I think is so beautiful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Life-changing events. You went through several of them. And I'm not going to lie, I did have to get out I had to get out the tissues. I'm just going to say that. And you were also taking care of your sister. And through it all, you just, like, you were there, you showed up in your true authentic self to who you were in that time. Like, things could have been so different and so dramatically different for you and your sister.
Yep, exactly. And a lot of times when we look back upon our lives and upon those specific times where we were harmed, we were hurt, we were going through very hard circumstances, we don't realize the angels that come along. And I had a lot of angels, and I talk about them in the book, specifically Alan, my nuclear physicist cowboy. He was absolutely an angel sent, and he had a divine purpose and showed up exactly when he needed to. And I've never heard from him again. And I've actually tried looking for him because I thought this would be, a full circle moment if I could find him. And I've never been able to find him. And that's just the way angels are. When you try to go back and find them, you can't. And that's exactly why they're called angels in your life.
Yeah. And what a way he came into your life. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. You were also very young when you started to ask yourself why. And not necessarily finding the answer, but you still asked those why questions, but then you took it upon yourself. And again, you're still very young. And perhaps maybe because that why was not meant to be discovered at that time, you started to blame it everything on yourself. That must have been quite the undertaking, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
We all take that on. When we don't find the answers to the why question, the first thing we do is blame ourselves. And that's a natural response. And the ego uses that trick, because it is a trick and it is a lie, as a protection mechanism for us not to go put ourselves back into situations that are similar, that we could be harmed again. And a lot of what I talk about in the book is how the ego rises up to protect you. And that's its job. And it did an excellent job as far as I was concerned. But there comes a point where the ego keeps you from actually living. The ego prevents you from becoming your authentic self because it keeps you always focused on the past, on the negativity, on the pain, and on the hurt. So transcend that fear, you don't move past and grow. And I stayed in a stuck mode. If you talk about the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the first one is sustenance, making sure you have food and clothing and roof over your head. The second one is safety. If you don't have safety, you can't actually go to the next level and start growing and learning and expanding. So I stayed stuck at 11 years old when my trauma occurred. And interestingly enough, studies have now shown, and there's science to back that up, that whatever age your trauma occurred, or whatever that was defining moment when you were a child, that you figured out that, okay, I have narcissistic parents, or my alcoholic mother is somebody I need to take care of. When you make that shift, and that becomes the place where you stay stuck until you start the healing journey. And only when you go back and start healing that stuck place can you move past the egoic mind's use of that trauma to keep you from growing and becoming your authentic self. But also, when you stay stuck, you look through life at that lens of an 11-year-old little girl. And so I spent my teen years, my 20s, most of my 30s, looking through the lens of an 11-year-old, trying to process big emotions, life-changing events, getting married, having children, through the idea of an 11-year-old's psychological makeup. And it's really difficult to do. If you look at it from that perspective, you can see why trying to heal sooner than later is always a better way to do it. And I'm part of my goal in telling my story and putting it out there is to help younger women so they don't have to wait until, I was 40 when I really had healing occurring. And then when I was 50, when I wrote the book, was finally when I was able to say to myself, yeah, I'm ready to tell my story. I was asked to tell my story when I was 19, and I said no. And then I was asked again at 22, and I said no. And part of that is being not only ready to share the story, and I didn't have an issue telling people, hey, I've had some trauma, I may react poorly, because I did react poorly to certain situations. And so I wanted to with people. But as I got older, I realized that there are lots of things that happen that I needed to be on the other side of the healing journey to really tell the story in a way that could help other people heal as well.
And that, I think, is so vitally important, that you realize that, as you mentioned, 19 years old, 22 years old, you weren't ready to share your story. You also mentioned ego a lot, and I think that is really important. And you're the expert on this, and I'd like to get your take on this, of course. Do you think part of the ego, obviously at most times to keep us protected, and even though that behavior is bad or not perhaps normal in somebody else's eyes. Do you think that we stay like that because that's, to us, it may be a normal type of behavior until, as you said, you weren't ready at 19 or 22. You were ready at 50 years old. And by the way, you don't look like you're in your 50s, just saying.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
But see, that's part of the awakening process. That's the part of the awareness process. It's part of the healing process, is being able to look and say, okay, is how I'm processing the events around me good for me? Or am I using old lenses? Am I using my past experiences that are tainted? And we have to understand that when we look at trauma taints everything, period. It taints everything. So if we're looking through the lens of trauma, we have to realize that how we're perceiving it is tainted in some way. That's neither good nor bad. It's just that we have to look at it with different eyes. And sometimes that means sharing it with somebody to give us a different perspective. And I'm a big proponent with finding one or two people you can share things with to get a different perspective, because my perspective on trauma is very concise. And if we want to talk about trauma, I can talk about trauma in all its different ways and different ways of processing events. But if we're talking about healing, healing happens in an individual process that I can help somebody heal. I can show them the journey I have taken, but they still have to do the work. I can't do the work for them. And that's one of the things that a lot of people who say, I want to be healed, I don't want this to bother me anymore, but that means you actually have to go back and do the work. And that is where it's one of the big things that I talk about with my clients is if you're not ready to do work, I can't help you. You have to be willing. And a lot of times what happens is people I talk about the thorny blanket in the book. Thorny blanket is a comfortable pain that you are aware of, pain that you know is hurtful, but you're so used to it that you accept it as part of life. And when you start feeling the heaviness of that thorny blanket and you start to take it off, I tried 2 or 3 times to take off my thorny blanket, but what I didn't realize the first time I tried taking it off is I still had wounds. I still had scabs that hadn't formed. I still had abscesses that were occurring. So instead of letting that thorny blanket come off and let the healing process start, I just kept putting it back on. But when you realize that, you take that blanket off and there's an open sore and somebody gently rubs your back and you're like, ouch, that hurts. And then you try to put that thorny blanket back on. No, that's part of the healing process. You have to scab over. You have to allow the healing ointment of love to come into your life to help soothe those abscesses and those scars. And when you allow that to occur, you never want to put the thorny blanket back on, but it's a different kind of pain, but healing is painful. And people think that healing is joyous and wonderful. No, that's the end of the journey. Healing process is somewhat painful because you have to go back and reframe the stories you've been telling yourself about your life. You have to reframe the perspectives you've had on, my mother is an alcoholic. Well, yes, she is. Is it my fault she's an alcoholic? Well, of course not. As adults, we completely understand that what our parents did is not our fault. But as the adult who's looking through the perspective of an 11-year-old little girl, it was my fault. I caused all this. And until you can look back at it and say, okay, as an adult, I can see that this little girl, she did nothing wrong. And what happened to her is sad, but it certainly wasn't her fault. So let's remove the blame. And let's remove the shame from it. And one of the big things about shame is, I was told when through all of that was happening with my trauma, shh, don't tell anybody. And of course I didn't for a long time. Part of not telling people means that you hold on to the shame. Shame is put upon you by other people, period. Any shame you feel is something that was put upon you by others. And the moment you start to tell your story and release that, the shame literally dissipates. The first time I actually told the story, I was no longer shameful about what happened because I realized that it wasn't my fault. And I knew it wasn't my fault even coming home, coming back from the situation that we were in. And I knew it wasn't my fault. But at the same time, I'm 11. And there was big emotions and with that an 11-year-old brain just can't handle.
Right. And, as you were describing that, I'm going back to those different scenarios as you're describing the thorny blanket. And that makes so much sense.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, you talked about you have to scab over. And I love how you describe that, because I think it gives somebody hope, knowing that it is going to be hard work. There's going to be thorny issues. There's going to be the scabs. But at one point, you're having a discussion with a college friend, and I started this. You had an aha moment.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of similar to what we were just chatting about. But I really want to pay homage to how you wrote this. You were giving yourself the grace and dignity. Having this aha moment, it waked you from what you referred to as a stupor of pain.
And during that conversation, a lot of times loving people, say things to a hurt person, and the hurt person gets defensive, and the hurt person doesn't understand the profoundness of the conversation they've had. And a lot of times in my life, when I know somebody really, truly cares about me as a person, and they say something that is like, that's out of line, I then go by myself and sit with it and ponder it, because maybe the universe is trying to tell me something. And through this experience, what this friend was trying to get me to realize was, we all go through, especially people who have had some sort of negative consequences that they're dealing with, that we all look at, why me? Okay, because we all go through the why me phase. But also then there is the victim mode. And I was in victim mode from the age of 11 until I had this conversation. And I was 18 when I had this conversation. And he said to me, this was the line he said to me, "You get something out of playing the victim." And that is shocking,
Mm-hmm.
number one. But number two, there's profoundness in that statement, because we don't, as human beings, we don't do things over and over and over again if we don't get something out of it. If we're eating that cookie every night we eat our cookie, there's something we're getting out of eating that cookie. We have to look at the bigger picture, and what is it that I'm getting out of eating this cookie? For me, playing the victim meant one really important thing. If Janice and I just met and I said, "I've had childhood trauma," Janice, you kind of are taken aback because people don't start conversations that way. And in the early 80s, when this was happening, when I was having these conversations with people, and it was 1986 when I had this conversation in college, when I would say something like that, "I've had trauma in my childhood," people would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." They would get very quiet, and most of them would leave me alone. And that's what I was getting. It was an effective way to push people away. Very effective in the early 80s for me. But later on, what I realized, a better way for me to tell people that I've had issues and not push them away at the same time, as well as understanding that you cannot heal in the vacuum. You must be able to share your story in order to start the healing journey. And therefore, no healing occurs in a vacuum. Healing occurs in a community. Healing occurs when you are able to share your story and understand and move past the fear, move past the egoic mind, and understand that who you authentically are was always there. And that conversation helped me switch from being a victim to becoming a survivor. And the moment you become a survivor, the other thing that people really want when they've had traumatic issues in their life is they want to feel powerful again. They feel like their power was taken from me and they can't do anything. The moment you become a survivor, you take your power back. So when I took my power back, the underscore of that is that you take responsibility for how your life moves forward from that moment on. So at that moment in time, I could no longer blame choices I was making on my trauma. I couldn't blame it on my mother being an alcoholic, because at this point in my life, my mother wasn't in my life. I wasn't communicating with her at all. All the people that caused my trauma were not a part of my life. But I was still making bad choices because of the trauma, but those were my choices to make. And when I took responsibility for even my bad choices, I became that true survivor. I regained my power and I forward instead of staying in the past and looking backward.
That is so deeply profound. Thank you so much for sharing that. In fact, I think that, this whole book as a whole is flipping amazing. But what you said in the last sentence, and I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'd like to read it for everyone. So very poignant. Only when I became aware could I change my mindset and therefore my life.
Exactly. Awareness is the hardest thing for anybody to get. And that's how you start the healing journey, is with awareness. And a lot of people say, well, I've been in therapy for years and years and years. And yet they're completely unaware of what triggers them. They're completely unaware of how they automatically respond to things because they've been doing it for so long. And part of the counseling services that I offer is being able to point out, well, wait a second, go back. Why did you respond that way? What, isn't that the right way to, it's not about right or wrong. It's about why did you do it that way? And a lot of times when you become aware of it was an automatic, knee-jerk reaction versus I paused and thought about it, and about reconnecting with your soulful self, take a deep breath. That's why lots of times, people tell you, take a deep breath before you answer. And the reason you take that deep breath is in doing so, you reconnect with your soulful self. You pause and you don't have the egoic fearful response. Instead, you have a soulful response instead of that fearful reaction.
Oh my gosh, that is so true. Of course, in reading this book as well, it made me go back to the traumas, of course, that I had went through. And I had a sense of gratitude knowing that what we know now through our stories, as you mentioned, really does help others.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy to tell your story. Sometimes it's not easy to even stand by your story, but in doing that in such a way that honors your journey, I think it's so very profound.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And it makes me go back to what you wrote in the afterword about transformation, where you mentioned transformation comes through our compassionate nature to accept others and ourselves. Terri, I think you have come full circle in so many different ways, and it's beautiful. was heartbreaking to read it, but it was poignant again in the sense of you sharing your story. Now, I know you mentioned, of course, that you work with clients that have gone through some really horrific type of experience. For anyone right now who, and I know this, this is somewhat of a blanket question, but what are some strategies that they can do when they want to take off that thorny blanket? You would mention, of course, taking that deep breath. What are some different strategies that somebody could perhaps do today?
So a lot of people have triggers, and when we are triggered, it is an egoic, fearful reaction to whatever the trigger was. And learning why we're triggered is key in being able to stop those egoic reactions and instead have soulful responses. And in doing so, when you have a soulful response, you end up reprogramming and rewiring your brain in such a way that it doesn't go back to make those automatic connections to that triggering reaction instead of now soulful response. So awareness, the way I talk about waking up and becoming aware is when you feel too tired to carry the thorny blanket anymore. And for a lot of people, that is realizing that life has to be better than struggling to survive. Mm-hmm. So you go from survival mode into thriving mode. Thriving is when things come easily. Thriving is when most of the time everything just you're going with the flow because you're accepting what is. One of the other strategies that I help clients implement once you have the awareness factor is understanding that there are times in our lives where we must be able to look back and reframe the stories that we tell ourselves. So one of the things that I talk about my story a lot because that's part of my work. But for most people, they don't have to tell their stories unless they want to. Okay. And I'm at a place where my story does not hurt me because I'm truly healed. And the way you change that perspective is instead of asking why me, you ask now what? Now what is a profound question that I did not realize was given to me when I was 12. When I was 12, my dad and I had a conversation about what had happened to me. And it was really the first time I had told him what happened. Mm-hmm. And he went through it all and he's listening and he's sitting there and, he's apologizing, feeling bad. And he says, now what? Now I'm 12 and I have done a little bit of research on prosecuting sexual child offenders. And I said, well, I don't want to prosecute if that's what you're saying. And he said, if that's what you don't want to do, we won't do that. But that's what I thought he meant. And the reality was he meant something bigger. He meant something more profound is, okay, this bad stuff happened. Now, what are you going to do about it? Now, what do you need to do to heal from it? Now, what do you need to do to overcome it? Now, what do you need to do to move forward in a way that you want to move forward? And we get so mired in the why me, we never get to the now what. And I was offered the opportunity at the age of 12 to move to the now what, but I didn't because I didn't see it. I didn't understand it. And then in my right at 40, now what happened? And it was like, wow, this makes perfect sense. And looking back, I'm like, it's really sad that I didn't pick up on it sooner, but that's also then where I understand for most people, they stay in the why me for a long period of time, looking for the answer. And the reality is there is no answer to the why me question. I can rationalize that it happened to me because my mother was an alcoholic. It happened to me because my mother wanted free drugs, so she allowed 3 men to take my innocence. Those are things that I can rationalize. Those are the facts of the situation. It doesn't give me the why me factor. Why me? But no matter what, even if I could, and see, when my mother passed, and I hadn't spoken to my mother for like over 6 years before she passed. And I was asked, how do you feel about your mother passing? I said, I don't feel anything, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, she's been dead to me for a long time. And I realized about 2 or 3 weeks after I found out she passed, and she had been dead for 3 months before my sister and I found out she died. And in those 3 weeks, I realized that, oh, I'm never going to get the answer to my question, why me? And that is when the now what occurred, when I realized that it doesn't matter. Now, what am I going to do that I can't get the why me answer? Well, I've been doing it. I've been going through the healing process. I've been taking my healing journey. I've been becoming my authentic self and unearthing all of that again. And for a lot of people, changing that question from why me to now what will be the most profound thing that they can do today to start moving forward in the life they want to live. The second thing would be to get to the place where you are no longer blaming, but taking responsibility for the choices you're making. Being responsible for your poor choices. And I made lots of them. And I point out in the book, I married my first husband for all the wrong reasons, because I wanted his mother as my mother. I was very, very open about that first marriage. And I just stayed with him because I made a commitment and I understood my commitment. And I made that conscious decision to make that choice, even though it was for all the wrong reasons. And as long as we take responsibility for the choices that we make, they all do work out in the end. If we choose to blame, then we don't learn the lesson that we're supposed to get from that experience and able to move forward.
Wow. Question for you. What's next?
Interesting. I actually, when I went, so I've vacations to New Mexico every year since I wrote the book. And when I went last year, I was contemplating writing a second book. And what I was revealed to me was that I have a series. So I'll be hopefully starting here in the next couple of months, I'll be working on the series. It'll be 7 books called Soul Solutions for mindfulness, Soul Solutions for transcending fear, specific things about ways to that I have been focusing on over the past 4 or 5 years anyway, and compiling that to come out with the 7 series books.
Wow, that is so exciting. And
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And I obviously somewhat knew that, but it is even so more exciting to know that a book series, 7 books, wow, that will have such a profound effect. That is amazing. And I'm so excited for you. That is wonderful.
Thank you.
You are so welcome. Before we sign up, where can our viewers and listeners connect with you further?
You can go to terrikozlowski.com, TerriKozlowski.com, or they can go to my podcast, the Soul Solutions podcast, and I put out an episode every Tuesday. And where it's a short podcast, normally about 15 minutes, where I provide you with actionable items that you can use to help you overcome your fears and limiting beliefs. And the month of August, we're focusing on, I take that back. The month of July, we worked on memories and how to deal with memories. And then the month of August, we're going to switch focus and look at more mindfulness things.
Wow, that sounds wonderful. And of course, I will make sure all of that information is in the show notes. I really could talk for another hour, but in the absence of time, I just want to hold up your book again before we sign off. Raven, Transcending Fear by the amazing Terri Kozlowski. Terri, I want to thank you so much for sharing your story and really inspiring others to work through. And you gave some amazing strategies. So thank you so much for that. If you have any questions or concerns and would like to reach out to Terri, please do not hesitate to do so. Go to her website, terrikozlowski.com. And of course, as I mentioned, I will make sure her other information is in there as well. Amazing book by
Thank you.
Terri. You're very welcome. Truly, these are the stories that inspire us today. I was inspired by her story, inspiring others. My name is Janice, the host of Stories That Inspire Us, the author series. Remember, if you have a story to share, if you are ready to share your story, we need to hear your voice. We need to hear your story, because you know what? It certainly will inspire others. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here today, and we shall see you again real soon. Bye for now.